Have you ever wondered why teenagers act like mental patients? Why do they make crazy, impulsive decisions? Why are they fearless, but can't understand the consequences of their decisions? I don't mean to alarm any of the parents in the audience today, but your teenager's brain is dysfunctional. Well, part of it is. And as the parent of three teenagers, I'm sure this comes as no shock to you. Today, I'm going to inform you about the development of the adolescent brain, talk about factors that hinder normal development, and in the end, ask you to consider whether we as parents, as a society, and as a nation of laws should reconsider our treatment of teenagers. Let's begin by looking in depth at one of the most mysterious parts of the human body, the brain. Most experts agree that the first 5 years of a child's development is crucial, as it is an enormous growth spurt in brain synapses. By 18 months, the neural foundations of a baby's emotional intelligence are laid. Even by 12 months, native language is established, and between the ages of 2 to 4, the number of synapses in the brain increases tenfold. Until recently, it was only commonly accepted that this was the only explosive growth spurt. Then, in the late 1990s, Dr. Jay Guide at the National Institute of Mental Health began a 10-year study of the development of the brains of children using functional MRIs. What he discovered astounded the scientific community. The second wave of the overproduction of synapses occurs just prior to puberty. He showed us that there are actually two major growth spurts in the brain, one at birth at 5 years and another between the ages of 12 and 17, the very years when teens are most susceptible to peer pressure. Areas with a more advanced functioning, like judgment and decision making, mature last, but not at the age of 15, 18, or even 20, but at the age of 25. But here's something interesting. As the brain grows, it doesn't grow proportionately as we once thought. Dr. Gee, through his imaging study, showed us that the first areas to mature are those at the extreme front and back, those with the most basic functions like sight and hearing. I don't know about you, but this is encouraging information for me as the mother of a 22-year-old. Here's an illustration. The occipital lobe, which is responsible for our vision, is located at the base of the skull and develops first. The temporal lobe, which interprets sounds and languages we hear, develops next. It's also where the hippocampus, the memory storage area, lies, which may explain how we can remember words to a song 30 years later. The parietal lobe processes tactile sensory information such as pressure and touch and pain. And finally, the frontal lobe, where reasoning, abstract thinking, and higher level cognition are formed. Today, we're going to take a closer look inside this frontal lobe to an area called the prefrontal cortex, or PFC, which houses the executive center. The PFC is one of the most complex areas of the human brain. It's responsible for controlling the flow of information. It's also responsible for moderating social behavior, including resisting peer pressure. In a study conducted by Dr. Thomas Powell of the University of Nottingham, it was found that teenagers with a higher resistance to peer pressure had high activity in a more developed prefrontal cortex. Scientists are just now discovering what insurance companies have known all along. At what age does your insurance go down? 25. Why is that? Because statistically, you're less likely to take risks. Within the PFC also lies what psychologists like to call the executive function. It allows us to differentiate between conflicting ideas, the difference between, say, good and bad, better and best, different and same. It also helps us work towards our defined goals, predict outcomes, and base our future expectations on actions. In the PFC, many different systems are running simultaneously. One of the most crucial is the dopamine system. In the PFC, dopamine, also called the feel-good chemical, functions as a neurotransmitter, sending signals from nerve cell ends to other nerve cell ends across a gap called a synapse. Dopamine is then reabsorbed in a process called the reuptake by the neurons, creating a very balanced system of releasing and replenishing. Pleasure is experienced during activities that release dopamine, like exercise, sex, food, and get this, even the promise of money. If dopamine is disrupted in the PFC, it can lead to a decline in neurocognitive functions, especially social attachment, judgment, memory, attention, and problem solving. Stimulants like cocaine and meth flood the PFC with dopamine, creating a high or spiked increase in pleasurable feelings. The problem, however, is that dopamine is no longer replenished naturally in the PFC. The brain has become dependent or addicted to the substance in order to experience pleasure. As the addiction progresses, higher and higher levels are required to attain the pleasure effect. At 16, because the brain is still developing, it is extremely sensitive to drugs. The changes caused during the formative years are more likely to stick and become hardwired as addiction by adulthood. Even worse, prolonged drug abuse that sustains abnormally high dopamine levels has been linked to psychoses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, which usually manifest during the teen years. New and frantic activities are constantly being produced in the explosive teenage brain. How does this affect teenage behavior? Let's take a look at a few sobering statistics. The National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse conducted a survey of high school seniors in 2012, which was posted on Teen Help's website in 2013. Here's what they found. 70% of all high school teenagers have used alcohol. 62% have been drunk in the past year. 30% have binge drank in the past 2 weeks. 34% admit to having used marijuana over the past year. 1 in 10 have used stimulants. Out of all the high school seniors, 65% of them have had sex, and 1 in 5 has had more than one sexual partner. By the age of 20, 34 of them have had at least one pregnancy, and sadly, 67% of those who did have sex wish they had waited. Is this crazy teenage behavior really just a product of upbringing and social economics? Or could it be also connected to a natural neurological function? In closing today, I've shown you how the adolescent brain develops, how the prefrontal cortex, the last area to develop, is responsible for so much of the advanced cognitive functions. I've shown you how in even normal development, adolescents are prone to risky and erratic behavior. But in those who abuse drugs, that decision-making process is severely compromised and can even result in psychosis and mental disorders. We have information and answers today more than ever before about the developing brain. But with these new answers come questions. Should we as parents reassess which decisions we allow our teenagers to make? Should we as a society reconsider appropriate ages for driving, for drinking, for voting, or for serving in the military? Should we as a nation abolish the practice of trying our teens as adults?